도마, 넘버링에, 창문올이야, 천지,
First of all, I would like to wish you all Tashi Dilek and offer you my greetings. Yesterday, I spoke a bit about how the Dharma becomes the path. When we say the Dharma becomes the path, that means that if we do not have the stable intention of a wish for emancipation in our mind streams, then whether we are taking vows or practicing virtue or listening, contemplating, and meditating, it does not become a method to achieve liberation, or it does not become Dharma. But if you even give the virtue of giving a morsel of food to another sentient being, if it is imbued with bodhicitta, it becomes a cause for achieving Buddhahood. And so I think this is how we should understand it. Thus, each of the three vehicles has their own way of explaining how the Dharma becomes the path. But if we summarize it, then in terms of the Great Enlightenment, there are two aspects. The way becomes the provisional path, and the way becomes the ultimate path to Buddhahood. So these are the two types that are taught. But in this text on the four dharmas, the way in which it becomes the path to liberation has already been described in the passage that teaches the faults of samsara. So this passage primarily teaches how Dharma becomes the Mahayana path. In particular, Gampopa's thought emphasizes the tradition taught in the White Lotus Sutra, and specifically the Mahayana sutras that teach there is only one path ultimately. And so the way we know this is that meaning or that point is explained in the introduction to the jewel ornament. And likewise, also in Flo Liak's notes on this root text of the Four Dhammas, it is said that in terms of the development of an individual's faculties, the path is taught as three variables in the expedient. So it's saying that this is the expedient meaning, that it is taught in three vehicles, but in actuality, there's only one path. And so the commentary written by Lolaya also says, in the definitive meaning, there's only one vehicle as a phrase that should be added. This point was explained at length in the White Lotus of True Dharma. And then he also gives many reasons and gives many citations about this, but I will not explain them now. So in brief, the way the Dharma becomes the path described in this passage is taught as it appears in other works of Gampopa. He describes how to establish the basis for the Mahayana path by imbuing it with a relative bodhicitta, and also how imbuing it with ultimate bodhicitta makes it into the actual path that severs the roots of clinging to the truth. And so that is how it is explained. And so among that all, and also there's Lama Sham Yudra, or Lam Saba, who says that saying the Dharma must become the path means that even if the Dharma becomes an antidote for the afflictions and tames your own mind stream, if loving kindness, compassion, and bodhicitta do not take root in your being, it does not become the Mahayana path. You have only achieved the path of the listeners and Pratitya Buddhas, not that of unexcelled enlightenment. Thus, no matter what, you must do whatever you can so that loving kindness, compassion, and bodhicitta take root in your being. As this says, fundamentally, whether it's Mahayana or not, it comes down to the distinction taught about between the distinction between the foundation, the vehicle, and the Mahayana. It comes down to whether you have the Mahayana bodhicitta resolve. And that comes down to whether great compassion has taken root in your being. And so that must be roused through the loving kindness, the seeing beings as attractive. And so in this way, we need to train our mind in stages. It doesn't, relative bodhicitta doesn't suddenly arise all at once. So in order to, I'd like to elaborate on this topic of loving kindness and share some thoughts of my own. I think I got stayed up a little bit late last night. During this time, I've only been getting only 3 or 4 hours of sleep a night. I've been working too much, so I don't feel like I have much energy today. But as you can all see behind, did you see the bamboo behind me? I think that maybe it has. You might think that it's just like. You might think it's like the movie Kung Fu Panda. Sometimes I think they say, "You look like Kung Fu Panda." When they say I look like Kung Fu Panda, I think that if I have the bamboo behind me, then you might think that actually the real living Kung Fu Panda is right in front of you. So generally, when we say loving kindness and compassion, loving kindness means the thought of wishing others happiness, and compassion means the thought of wishing others to be free of suffering, as most of you know. But the understanding of loving kindness and compassion, the Mahayana, is not just understanding the words. It is a far vaster and more profound understanding of the meaning. I think that loving kindness and compassion connected to the way we actually view and the way we actually see other sentient beings. And the meaning of this is that, for example, ordinarily, we have a relatively simplistic way of having sympathy for other sentient beings, which is that we just feel sympathy for them. And so primarily, is looking outside at other people's situations and suffering. That's the type of thought that it is. And when that thought grows stronger, then it becomes an intention to share in other people's empathy, of wishing to share in others' joys and sorrows, or empathy. And what that means is, and so that means that we bring others' suffering into our own experience. And it's becomes the intention to put ourselves in their position. But loving kindness and compassion aren't really just feeling sympathy for others. And they're not just bringing their suffering into your own experience. I think that there is an even more profound understanding, an even more profound meaning. And this is because loving kindness and compassion are not just feelings or ways of thinking. They aren't just sort of attitudes. Their prajna, or the recognition of what the ultimate critical points are, and that arises, and so that become the conduct and the practice that arise out of those. And so what is the way to recognize? And so what is the manner that we need to recognize this? It is to recognize that we and others are inseparable, or that we and others are equal. So we humans, from ancient times until today, we know one way of projecting names, labels, of designating and labeling things. And that is to call the aggregates that we are able to control, or this body, me. When there is someone else, when there are aggregates or bodies before our own mind that we are not able to control, we call that other. And this way of designating or projecting labels, is this something that we naturally know? It's not. It's something that other people teach us. In this way of dividing or calling us me, you, and them, and so forth, is something that we humans have invented for many different reasons. And one reason why we can say this is that in this earth, there are some ancient languages where there are not clear words that mean I or you. There are such languages. And in terms of that terms, when we think about the ultimate way of looking at it, or another way of thinking about it, is there such a great distance as we think between me and you and them? Actually, there's no way to really separate others. For another way we can think about it, when we say me, you, and them, is there such a great distance between you and me and other? There's not such a great gap between us. Not only is there no great gap between us, but me, you, and them, we're actually all equal and all the same taste. When we think about it that way, and we think about the nature in this way, then between me and all humans, or between me and all sentient beings, there's not such a division or gap as we might think that there is. Just because I'm not able to control someone else's body does not mean that it can be categorically determined that they and I are different. Nor is it necessary to think that, because there's not really any evidence or any incontrovertible reason at all of you and me being different, or of they and me being different, being unrelated entities, or of us being single and independent. This is just a projection of thinking that that individual beings are single and independent. We make it up conceptually. It is not true. It is not the nature of things that they are true. It is not true in fact. But we are so habituated to thinking in that way, projecting it in that way, that we think it's fitting and appropriate. And for that reason, we don't even feel, it's difficult for us to even have any misgivings or any doubt that that way of thinking might not be exactly how it is. To give an example of this, on this earth, there are a couple hundred nations, aren't there? And each of them has borders. When we talk about a border, they were invented by humans. And people had to think hard and work hard and think hard in order to invent them. But if we look at the natural environment, there are no national boundaries and no borders in terms of the natural environment. When a tree grows, it doesn't look to see if there's a national border. When birds fly in the sky, they don't have any borders. Bugs who dig into the earth, they don't have borders. Even in the end, even with people, if you do not explain to them that a border is such and such and show them this, explain to them what a nation is, they won't understand what a border is. Similarly, between you and me, between myself and other, there's no natural distinction or no true division. But we make up names and project them onto things and make up the divisions. So if in actual fact there is no division between us and others, in between ourselves and others, we say, well, actually, externally, our bodies are dissimilars. Our clothes are different. Our thoughts aren't the same. And the way we act are all dissimilar. And so I wonder how that could be. This occurs because we have really deep imprints of dualism. For example, because of the way our coarse physical support, the body, was formed, the way the body of flesh and blood was formed, we have the opportunity to enjoy sensory pleasures. But it prevents our consciousnesses also from moving about without impediment. It obstructs us from accessing the full capacity of our consciousness. When we die and are in the bardo, the bodily support of the body in the bardo is like a subtle body or a mental body. That can't obstruct the capacity of consciousness. So wherever we think we're to go, we can go without any obstruction. So that's what it's like in the bardo. And so for that reason, you have a subtle body or even a mental body. That can't be impeded. So it's different. That mental body is different when it's living. And so there are fewer impediments to being able to bring out the full capacity of consciousness. And so for that reason, it is said to be easier to recognize our own nature in the bardo than when we are living, as many lamas have said. So in brief, the loving kindness and compassion explained in Mahayana, if we talk about them way people in sort of a colloquial way, so we don't think about other. So it means we don't think about other people, others. We think that there are parts of ourselves, or that they are us, and it means thinking that there's no distinction between ourselves and others. And that's the type of attitude or the type of thought we need to carry or bring. For example, some great individuals are actually able to take other suffering upon themselves. So they can, like when other people are feeling illness, they can actually transfer that to themselves. They have that capacity. And the main reason why they're able to do that, if we think about it, of course, there are many reasons, but the main reason, within the expanse or within the depth of their realization, they see that they and others are equal. And I think that is why they can do it. And so that is how I see it. So in brief, so in the depths of their hearts, they don't make any divisions between self and others. So without it being mixed with self-interest for even an instant, and they're entirely free of attachment and fixation. And so for that reason, they are naturally able to act for the welfare of other sentient beings. And so that being the case, we often say that we need to cherish others more than ourselves. And when we need to say cherishing others more than ourselves, this doesn't mean that we need to be some great hero who sacrifices everything, who jumps into the fray first. That's not what it's saying. It's primarily, it's as I have already said. We have a mistaken way of thinking. And we need to cleanse it of its stains and know the actual nature of what it is, in fact. That's the most important point. For example, if you have a picture or a drawing that you've drawn it up, and if you roll it up and you put it away for a long time someplace else, then one day when you unroll it, then it just rolls itself back up. So at that time, if you roll it up the other way, then when you unroll it again, it'll be flexible. It'll lay flat. And so, like in that example, we all have a very strong habit of thinking that there's a great gap between ourselves and others, or that we are separate and distinct and in control. Since that is so strong, it's easy to feel heartfelt, affectionate thoughts for yourself. And for your close friends or relatives, where you think of them as being close, it's also fairly easy with them to develop compassion or affection. But with other than them, it is extremely difficult to have such a loving thought for other sentient beings as you have for yourself. So for that reason, when we are training our minds, we first train ourselves in love for ourselves, the wish for emancipation, and then we train in love for others. And then we train in the equality of self and other, then in exchanging oneself for others, and then in thinking of ourselves and others as being inseparable. And so we train our mind in stages. And so this softens our hardened characters. And the ropes of thinking that we are single, or the bonds of thinking that we are single and in control, get looser and looser. In the end, just like the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, we will be able to realize that we and others are all equal. And I think that we can do this. If we think about it from the perspective of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, so what is it like for them? In terms of the perspective of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, there's probably no distinction between us and them. We become like a part of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And I think that that is how they think. Thus, when Buddhas and Bodhisattvas act for the benefit of others, they don't have attachment to anyone, and they treat everyone completely equally. Likewise, when their qualities of abandon and realization reach such a high level, they transcend the coarse aggregates in the body of flesh and blood. And so their realization has transcended the body, and so their consciousness dwells in an unimpeded, unobstructed way. And so because of that, the connection between us and Buddhas and Bodhisattvas primarily comes from a connection of the mind, from faith and longing and so forth. So normally we need to make a connection to someone, so we have to speak. But for the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, you don't need to talk. Generally, we recite orally, and they can hear that. But the main thing is that whatever thought occurs to us, or whatever motivation we have, the moment we have it, they immediately know it. And they immediately know it clearly the moment they arise. Thus, normally, when we're reciting prayers and aspirations or whatever, our minds and our mouths have to be together. is that if they aren't together, if we like pretend, if we're trying to be clever and pretend, then we're only fooling ourselves, and we can fool other people, but we aren't able to fool the bodhisattvas and Buddhas. The reason is because they know it all very clearly. And so that being so, at any time, we must have pure motivations and faith and devotion. This is very important when we pray and supplicate the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. This is extremely important. And that is the reason why. When we're reciting prayers and aspirations, what we're thinking about, are pure or not, is important. The Buddhas and Bodhisattvas don't look to see who's offering the biggest stick of incense or the largest lamp. They don't think, whose prayers are they listening to? They don't first think to that, who are the VIPs, or, they don't think about offering refuge to the VIPs first. That's not how they think. In the actual matter of fact, whoever is praying for them, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas know the hopes and prayers of all sentient beings the moment the beings make those. They don't make any distinctions of who is prayed first or who is most important. In other words, they know all the situations of whether you're happy or sad immediately at the same time. And so there's no distinction of earlier, before, or closer and more distant. So if you think about it in terms of the bodhisattvas and bodhisattvas, not only is there no distinction between us and them, they also don't see any distinction between us and other sentient beings. And so that being so, they always look at us as if we were family. They view us as family members. They never see us as outsiders or non-family. But we don't believe strongly enough. And so we think of the Bodhis and Bodhisattvas as being outside. We separate them out and put them on a high pedestal far off. And that's how we identify them. And once you've put them on a pedestal and far away, we get the feeling that the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas are distant from us. But in actuality, the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas accompany us like a bodhisattva in the shadow. They're never apart from us, even for an instant. They're not so extremely far away in some, Akanishta or other pure realm. This was something that we need to look at a telescope to see. You had to get a huge telescope to look at the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. That's not what they're like. In brief, the loving kindness and compassion as taught about in the Mahayana is a presentation on that sort of a presentation of that sort of a deep and profound and ultimate nature. If we can know what the situation and the way things are is by penetrating the critical points. If we are able to know them, then say, may all sentient beings be happy, or may all sentients be free of suffering, is no longer a mere aspiration. It's not just a dream. It's something we can actually do. To give an example, for example, if we want to make ourselves happy, if we do something that we like, are we able to do it? We think it's possible. We don't think that we aren't able, or that it is impossible, right? And so for that reason, on that day when we are able to see that we and all sentient beings are inseparable, you'll have that same sort of thought for all sentient beings. And so that day when you have that thought, you say that, saying, may all sentient beings may be happy, may they all be free of suffering, becomes something that you feel like you can do, not something that is just a mere hope. And so that I think that's enough for about the the Dharma becomes the path for now. I did think that there are some things I had to say about the topic of emptiness and so forth and the lack of reality, but I haven't had enough time, and so I'm not able to share them now. So now I'd like to speak about the way the path dispels the confusion. And so I'm just saying something in order to not completely omit the text. And so what it says in this text is, when you understand that, the path dispels confusion. First, meditating on impermanence dispels the confusion of fixation on this life. Meditating on karmic cause and effect dispels the confusion of wrong views. Meditating on the defects of samsara dispels the confusion of attachment to the samsara. Meditating on loving kindness and compassion dispels the confusion of the foundation vehicle. Meditating on phenomena being like dreams and illusions dispels the confusion of attachment to things being real. In general, the higher dispel the confusions of the lower. So generally, this way that the path dispels confusion can be joined with the path of the greater individual, or it can be joined with the paths of the three types of individuals, or it can be joined with the path of mantra. So there are three different ways. But here, it is taught in terms of joining it to the three types of the individuals. Now, all the main points, I've already explained all the main points. And so I don't think there's any reason to repeat them now.
다 되려야지. 다들이 다 주둔이버 니나로래야지. 쉬어야 가면서나. So
now what I will speak about in this second session is how confusion arises as wisdom. So I'll talk about how confusion arises as wisdom, and that in this in our root text, what it says is, so next is confusion arising as wisdom. When through the power of meditating on all phenomena as being free of arising and ceasing, you cut through everything, no matter how it appears or is realized in your own nature, confusion has arisen as wisdom. So generally when we say confusion arising as wisdom, most people explain this in connection with the path of mantra. But there is a way to explain it in connection with both Sutra and Tantra. And Dr. Rinpoche said in his great collection of Dharma talks, there are two aspects to confusion arising as wisdom: the tradition of its transcendences and the tradition of the secret mantra Vajrayana. In the tradition of the transcendences, confusion arising as wisdom means that because of the way that the cognition dispels confusion is like a dream or an illusion, everything that is perceived and all perceivers have never been separate from the very beginning. When you realize that the non-dual nature is pure by essence, does not appear, has no appearances, and that the perceiver and perceiver has subsided and that is free of conceptual extremes, that is confusion arising as wisdom. According to the secret mantra tradition, confusion arising as wisdom means all confusion and non-confusion are inseparable from your own mind. Because they are not separate, they are the nature of mind, the essence of mind, manifestations of mind. The confused is clear and thought-free, clear and empty and undefilable, clear, empty and continuous, clear, empty and free of center edge, naked and unsupported awareness. You must realize this meaning clearly in the ground. This is the co-emergent mind essence. It is the essence of the Dharmakaya, and co-emergent appearances are the light of the Dharmakaya. External apprehended objects and all that appears are not separate from the mind essence. They must arise as non-dual, equal and elaborate and great bliss. To sum it up, confusion is ignorance, and when awareness arises as wisdom, confusion arises as In some, there's the path is the way of all distributed appearances, subject and object, disappearing in the meditated equipoise and seeing the Dharma nature directly. And so that's and then in the post-meditation, without that wisdom getting lax, you see all appearances as like dreams and illusions. So in the Tantra, all confusion arises, accused appears arise from the unadulterated luminous mind. And then through the stages of light, increase in attainment, in the end, they dissolve into that unadulterated luminous mind itself. Or through that itself, they merely become manifest. All confusion ceases on its own. So here, at this point, the actual way that confusion arises as wisdom is generally taught in terms, it needs to be taught about in connection with Tantra and in connection with Mahamudra, I believe. And the reason for this is that it says in Hlolayak's commentary on the Four Dharmas, generally, by meditating on the specific Mahayana path, all the deficiencies, stains, and confusions are not viewed as something to discard. They can be made to arise as wisdom. In particular, though, through the power of perception, all confusion is unobservable by nature. By the power of the blessings of the play of wisdom, they are realized in an instant. Thus, these are the instructions on the fourth, confusion arising as wisdom. And so basically, when we talk about wisdom, confusion arising as wisdom, it's taught about primarily in terms of the Tantra and the Mahamudra. Needs to be joined to the practice of those two. Now, generally, in the different Tantras, there are many different ways of manifesting ways or paths to manifest the nature in both the causal and the resultant vehicles. So Gampopa said in Dusing Khenpo's Dialogues with the Gampopa, so there are three paths. And the three paths are taking inference as the path, taking blessings as the path, and taking perception as the path. And so it's so in the context of the sutras, the meaning of the nature of mind itself, or the nature of things itself, is realized gradually through evidence and inference. In the context of Tantra, and through deity yoga and the interdependence of channels, pradhanas, and baddhas. And in the context it is of Mahamudra, through the unmistaken restrictions given by the exalted guru, that is how it is manifested. And so in particular, you have to, in Mahamudra, you follow so these are the methods or the particular features of how to point out the nature state nakedly and directly, in particular through the unmistaken instructions given by the guru. There are also two types of individuals who enter the three paths, so which Gampopa says are the instantaneous and the gradual. So Gampopa says the instantaneous are individuals who have trained and who have shallow imprints of the impediments, such as the and they also have the deep imprints of the Dharma. This is extremely difficult, and I consider myself Gampopa. So basically, for the individuals who manifest the nature, there are the instantaneous and the gradual. And the instantaneous means someone who doesn't need to train in this lifetime, but as someone who's done a lot of training in previous lives and has very deep imprints and very stable imprints in the training. That is what is necessary to be instantaneous. And so some people think that instantaneous means that someone who has never trained the path and someone who has never trained in previous lives. If you think that, it is mistaken. So generally in all scriptures, the most well-known is the method of chaining through by entering the three trainings in stages, or by following the stages of the paths of the three types of individuals and training in them in an order. So this is what is most commonly known. And so there are many people who say that the Dabhokaja explanation of the instantaneous methods of manifesting the nature are not right, that they're inappropriate. Many people have made such objections. The most famous objection is the Sakya Pandita. In his exposition on the three vows, he makes many objections to the Kagyu, and one of these is about how one trains in the path. And the words is in the present Mahamudra and the Dzogchen of the Chinese tradition are going from the top to bottom and the bottom to top. Other than giving them the names of instantaneous and gradual, there is no distinction in the meaning. So when the Dapo Kagyu said that there's a difference between the instantaneous and the gradual individuals, he says that they're following the Chinese traditions. And among them, he talks about the Chinese Dzogchen, and I don't know what the Chinese Dzogchen tradition. I don't think that there's any Dzogchen in China. But when he's talking about the Chinese Dzogchen, what he probably means is the Chinese Zen tradition. And that Chinese Zen tradition is what Tibetans call that the Chinese Hashang. And the reason why they call it the Chinese Hashang view is they've come from, it's a tradition that's come from the Chinese. And so it's one reason why they're called Chinese. And Hashang means, Hashang is actually just a Chinese word. If you were to translate it into Tibetan or English, it would mean Kempo, or it would be abbot, the person who gives the vows. And that's what is understood. But these days, when we say Kempo, it has become a level of scholarly achievement. But here it is meant as terms of the person who gives ordination. But it can also be used to refer to all monks. But in the old times, it primarily meant the Khenpos who gave traditions. For example, there's the word lama in Tibetan, which when we say Tibetan, we don't call everyone lamas, right? But when you go abroad, all Tibetan monks are called lamas. They use the word lama for all Tibetan monks, so that's the same. So basically, in 786 AD, in the Tibetan histories, so in 786 AD, I always get this date wrong. So in 786, into the 8th century, the Tibetan Emperor Trisong Detsen invited from what's in present-day Tunhong in China. He brought the Khenpo Mahayana, or Great Vehicle, and he invited him to Lhasa. And so while he was in Tibet, Kamalashia and other Indian scholars, there was a controversy between them. So the Indian scholars said that the explanations of the Chinese scholars, the explanations of Hashang Mahayana, do not match the teachings in the words of the Buddha. And so it's that there's that controversy. And so and what this is called in many in the Tibetan history is it's called the Tunmen and the Tsenmen controversy. So Tunmen and Tsenmen are these are not Tibetan words; they are Chinese words. If you were to translate them into Tibetan, they would be called the simultaneous and the gradual. So Tunmen and Tsenmen means the simultaneous, the gradual and the simultaneous. So later, there were most of Tibetan history letters there are probably 90 different separate translations. And 90 of them, these 90 all say that Mahayana lost the debate, and that it and that the Chinese Hashang view was not allowed to spread in Tibet. This is what is well known. And so for that reason, many later Tibetans say that the Dapo Kagyu are followers of the Chinese Hashang and that they're wrong vows. And they spent many years wearing black hats in teaching that. But later there were many texts in Dunhuang. There are many texts from the time of the Tibetan emperors, and among them there is one about the pith instructions of. There is one about the Mahayana instructions on instantaneously realizing the nature, and so this was written in the year 794. This is the same year as the Tunsen and that the controversy about the simultaneous and gradual views was completed. It was the same year. So it's that same year. That's the same year that controversy was resolved, or that concluded. Now, there are two different manuscripts there. So in the Tunhuang manuscripts, there are two manuscripts. One has been preserved in a library in Paris, France, and one has been conserved in the British in the British Library. Now, there is an introduction at the beginning of this manuscript, and what it says there: the Emperor Chisun Denten invited three masters from, including Khenpo Mahayana, and they brought 30 Brahmas from India. When Mahayana was there was, this is the time when the empress Ansumudra took monastic vows, and the person who gave her the vows was the Chinese Hashang Mahayana master. Now the next year, there's the monkey year, and I'm not sure which year it is because I haven't researched. The Indian master said that Hashang Mahayana's view did not match the words of Buddha and therefore should be banned. They requested this of the emperor. Mahayana was disappointed, and he requested the emperor, said that let's have a dialogue with the Indian masters. Let's talk it through. He made this request, and the emperor said, "Of course, it's fine." And so Mahayana and the Indian masters had a very long discussion. Usually, we'd say that they had discussions over the course of 2 years, 1 or 2 years, maybe 3 years. In the very end, after they had so much discussion, Hashang Mahayana, they were unable to defeat Hashang Mahayana. And when they couldn't defeat him, the Indian monks, what they did is they weren't able to. They gathered all the texts together and considered it as if he had been defeated. They considered that, but from Mahayana's perspective, there are many different texts that were supported. He had a lot of support in the Tibetan and Shinto texts, and so because of this, all the Brahma monks from India were afraid and didn't know what to do, according to Mahayana. Then in the dog year, on the 15th day of the first month, the Tibetan emperor made an announcement. It spread it as an announcement to everyone, and he said that Mahayana's Samten tradition fits with the words, and it definitely fits with the tradition, and there's no mistake there, and so you cannot stop it. Everyone should respect it, and anyone who wishes to practice may. And so this is the instruction, and then following that later, there's a list of all the topics and all the points of their discussions, and this is the text that we definitely have to examine, that we have to research. But this text is in Chinese. I've seen that someone has translated from Tibet, has translated into Tibetan. And I have translated the introduction into Tibetan. Not only is there that text, there's also the Pangtang insect from the time of the emperor. And so this is an index of Dharma texts. So it's also called the Great Index. So there are 3 different indexes or codices just compiled at that time. There's the Pengarwa, there's the Dengarma, and Pangdama. Those 2 codices are still present. There's the Chenpowa, which is missing. In any case, in this index, there are many Chinese Zen tradition texts from the Chinese Zen tradition. Probably something like 10,000, but I haven't listed them. But it is from the time of the Tibetan emperors. Chisung Detsen did allow it. There is that index. Likewise, there's Nupchen Sangye She. I'm not exactly certain when he was born, but usually when I teach him, it seems like he probably was at the time of the time of Chisung Detsen, and some people say that he was later. So I haven't had a chance to check his dates of birth. But in any case, but this is an old text. And what it says is that the tradition of the causal vehicle, the 2 types of sharp and dull faculties are the institutus and graduates. So because of the distinction between sharp and dull, they're the 2 types of individuals, the instantaneous and the gradual. And the gradual they're from the Tibetan. They assert the texts of the Indian Master Kamalashila. And these are not entirely. And these do not have the entire. These are not the texts of all of the entire and definitive meaning. The instantaneous lineage are the tradition that went from Kashyapa to Dharmabodhi. And so then it says, and then the last in this is Hashang Mahayana, are the texts, the simultaneous tradition. These are the complete set of scriptures. And so what he is saying here is that there's the Zen tradition that passed down from Chinese Zen tradition that passed down from Dharmabodhi, which the Tibetans call the Chinese Hashang view. And so that is the tradition that this is identifying. And so this is a textual tradition that has both the entirely complete tradition of both the expedient and the ultimate meanings. So now, in the Chinese Zen tradition was first originated in India. It is not at all something that was invented by the Chinese Buddhists. There was it was spread in India, or it's in China, by the Indian master Bodhidharma. And he took as his primary source the Travels to Lanka and other sutras of the last turning the wheel of Dharma. But then he had the sixth patriarch, Huineng, also recognized that there were some sutras in the second term of the wheel, such as the Vajracenter, that he considered very important. Now, actually, the sixth patriarch was illiterate, but he had a natural faith in the meaning of the Prajnaparamita. So instead of relying on texts, he developed realization only by relying on the pith instructions of great gurus. And because of he developed realization, and his tradition is called the Southern tradition, the Southern Zen, or the instantaneous type. Now, he also had a Dharma brother who was the same teacher, and this is a famous Zen Kempo whose name was Xuan Shou. So Xuan Shou became well known among other students, all the students of his teacher. He became the one of the most learned in the. But because he was given these teachings were given to Huineng, he then went to the north. And then for that reason, his tradition was called the Northern Zen, or the gradual tradition. So in this way, there are the two. In the Zen tradition, there are two. There are the gradual and the simultaneous tradition, these two. When they say the gradual, that what they mean is someone who's previously studied and then eliminates all their confusion. The simultaneous means those who do not rely on words and text, but instead point out the nature directly. So basically now there's not necessarily certain, it's not categorically so that all the Chinese Zen teachers teach the simultaneous tradition. Likewise, there also is another Chinese tradition, the Tian Tai tradition. And this relied on the teachings of the White Lotus Sutra that taught the developing the potential of the bodhisattva that arising simultaneously. So those who had already developed, aroused that throughout the Mahayana family were simultaneous, and those who had not yet aroused the Mahayana family were the gradual. Now, there's a lot to be said about this, but I don't have time to say about them. So, for what the most important one is, somebody said Hashang, the name, the Hasha, the Hashang view, that term itself is wrong. It's not it's not a single person's view. His lineage is called the Chinese Zen tradition. It's that lineage. It's the view of that. It's the view and explanations of that tradition. It's not a single person's. And so these days, the Zen tradition is spread all over the world. And to say that's all a wrong view, to a mistaken view, if we were to have to say that, it would be rather difficult, I think. However, but actually, when we were all just in Tibet, we were known as an isolated country. So to say that the view is mistaken, we all just took it for granted that it was. And everyone makes a big lot of noise about it all being a mistake. There's no problem with that. But now in these days, when we Tibetans have left that isolated country, and we've come to all over the world. And we need to say things that people are going to be able to accept. If we continue to say all the things that we traditionally say in the old times, it'll be difficult for us to get along with other people. So in brief, when we talk about the Tibetan histories, most people of what they do is they follow other people's hearsay. When some person says something, then they follow that. And there are very few who actually do their own research and explain based on their own research. And so if someone in the past made a mistaken explanation, then all of their followers will naturally also be mistaken. If they have this thought that you need to if you want to, you have to first of all, you have to sort of take a detached view, and then you have to not follow other people. Then the next thing is you need to not follow other people's hearsay, and then you need to use the strength of your own intelligence to examine whether what we say in the Tibetan tradition is true, whether it's mistaken, and we can determine whether or not there are mistakes, and decide whether or not it's true. And I think if we do that, and so for that reason, so generally, there are so many things that I could say. There's a successive, there's the gradual and the instantase, and then what is there? And then there's the list of the four yogas, the sequence of the four yogas in the Kagyu tradition, and we talk about the four yogas. They say that this is an invention of the kaijus, and this is not in the kaijus and in the kanji and the tenju. And I thought I ought to speak about that, but I haven't had time to prepare it. Likewise, there's no time. So in the future, if there is more time, I would like to continue and explain more about these. So next, so generally, now, this I've done as much as I could to give the best teachings I could during this Gunshu teaching. But I do not think that it turned out 100% as I wanted to do, that it turned out well. But basically, in order to not to break the cycle of interdependence, and so that as not to disappoint you, I think I've explained enough to do that, or taught enough to do that. So around the time of the Tibetan Losar, I think maybe we'll have a teaching for the nuns Shedras. But we haven't, I can't tell you, we haven't determined the dates. I think I just had the idea that we should do this, but we haven't specifically set the schedule. So next, the Shedras say that they'd like to offer mandala and representations of body, speech, and mind, but how? If I were actually there, it would look good to offer a mandala, but if you offer it through over the internet, the person who is supposed to take the recipient can't take it, but the offers can't actually make it. But if we'll just pretend that we're actually doing it. So it's like the story of Apaho. So when the Lama is giving an empowerment, then just imagine that imagine that you're receiving the empowerment. So the Tibetans said, "Oh, there's something to say." They think, "Oh, this is great." And so he took some butter, and he offered the butter to it, and he said, "Lama, please imagine that you're receiving this butter," and then he took it back for himself. So it's like that. So that's the way it's like. We are now having a thank you speech put on by the Surmang Monastery. This is Khenpo Topten from Surmang Monastery, opening with some verses. So all of us students and teachers from the Kagyu Shadows, with our deep faith and devotion, would like to offer our greetings and Tasha Delek to the Gyawan Karmapa Orjin Tunle Dorjin. So because of many conditions and situations, the Gyawan Karmapa was unable to come in person. But so finally now after a long time, we've been able to receive the blessings of a teaching and see him in person. So is now following the tradition of the Kagyu masters, explaining the teachings of the past, giving us the teachings on the 4 dharmas of Gampopa. And we have all students, we have the opportunity to listen to the nectar of his teachings on the teachings. And so we have through the Gyawan Karmapa to give us the 9 Shadras, in particular a teaching on this, and to see his holiness, and to give us the instructions on the pith instructions through the internet. We would like to say, offer our great thanks for that. And so, because we did not want the Kagyu Gunsha to be entirely missed this year, we asked His Holiness to give the teachings over the internet. And we have, when His Holiness accepted the invitation, we've all delighted and we've listened with great delight. And so we have has been able to His Holiness has been able to do a lot of work. He has written a commentary on the 50 verses about the Guru in Chinese. He is also working on a commentary in Tibetan on the jewel ornament of liberation. And so there are many different ways of explaining the texts, and we in the Shadows do not always know, but we also so we thank His Holiness for explaining everything. And so may your activity spread like the waxing moon. And may be able to guide all sentient beings gradually to the state of realizing the profound nature. And may remain in this earth for many eons.
So
Khenpo Rinpoche was really kind of showing off. Gunsha when you were the Umze. What Kempo did when he was playing the cymbals. He probably never played them much. So Kempo is probably he got blisters from holding the cymbals. So I had a lot of difficulty with it. So thank you. So you better. So next. This opportunity to teach the profound and vast Dharma in the Shedra, I feel, is a very great fortune for me. And this opportunity, or such an opportunity, I'd like to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. And so primarily, it's our Kyabje Suman Gaon Rinpoche and the Shedra and the monks of the Surma Monastery. You have done all the preparations for this and made the request for this. And so I'd like to thank you all from the bottom of my heart. And next, I don't have much else to say. When I look out, so generally, I don't have the qualities of abandonment and realization that the great masters of the practice lineage of the past did, but now in this degenerate time, and in particular at a time when the Kagyu teachings are in a difficult situation, I feel a bit of a enthusiasm or determination about that. Particularly, for the past couple of years, the feeling that I've had is, I think perhaps I need to live for a long time. I've thought this. No, I never had this thought much before, but I do see a few reasons. If I can do something for the beings of the teachings, this isn't a question of my own capacity, but there's a sense of if you get the opportunity, you can't do it. If you say someone else is going to do it and hope for someone else to do it, it's not going to work. In particular, in the future, there are the masters and the Kagyu great Rinpoches will continue to happen, but sometimes. But if we all get old and leave, it's difficult. So no matter what difficulties or hardships that happen, I think if we can take that, I think if I can take it on myself, and so I feel this courage to do this. And so I have this idea that I can maybe live for a long time. Of course, I can't say how long I'll live. But I do have the resolve to live a long life. And that's the feeling I have in my mind. So this year, so generally it's my obstacle year, but all the monasteries and nundas have really done a lot of pujas on my behalf. You've done them very well. So I'd like to thank you very much. It's very kind of you. So all of you are making the aspirations, and as I just mentioned, have that thought. Maybe I'll stay and do something to benefit. If I could stay and do something to benefit the beings and teachings, and I have that idea. But the main thing, the most important thing, is that I can live for a long lifetime. I've read many master teachers. Many of them didn't live very, very long. Because no matter how many qualities of being learned and venerable good, because they didn't live a long time, there was not much came of it. And so I have this idea that I can stay here and continue to live for a long time. And so please, all of you, please pray that this may come to pass. Now, before I make any announcements, my announcement is this, that this year we can't hold the Kagyu themselves, so as to take its place, we will have an internet Monlam. And the time of that, the dates of that Monlam will be the January 20th until the 27th. So it's 8 days long. So these are 8 days long. We'll do this over the internet. So we'll do that similarly to how we did this before. But I thought I would make this announcement in English and Chinese as well. But I'll pretend that I can speak in these languages. I have to check my voice first.
2020 was a difficult year for everyone because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in 2021, it is not possible to hold the Kagyu Malam in Bodh Gaya. So from January 20th to January 27th, there will be a program of 8 days of prayers called Aspirations to the End Adversity. Like before, there will be different prayers every day. The sessions will start at 1300 GMT, and the prayers will be available in an ebook on the Dharma eBooks website. They have one Dharma eBooks website. OK， 由于这个疫情的关系呢，就2020年呢，就是对于这个每一个人来说的话，都是非常辛苦的一年。而今年的这个2021年的这个祈愿法会也无法举行在菩提迦耶，所以呢，从这个月的这个20到27号。我会带领大家进行为期8天的网络共修，叫做除障祈愿共修。跟去年的这个祛病消灾的共修一样，我们每天都会念诵不同的内容。8天当中呢，每天的这个共修都会在格林位置就是标准时间的这个13点钟开始，共修的法本也将在这个近期上传在这个 Dharma eBook 的这个正法电子是吧？正法网站是吧？电子书的这么一个网站上，所以呢，之后大家都可以下载。
So now we'll recite. First we have to
진진 셰베 기부 당바는 벤주루 기진 유린 샵된쇼 개근인지랑소 까마바 예근 첼레지드 까마 개근 동소 왕그로 까마바 우옌존데 첼레 샵된스 청아 친부라엔 동해 semjen 다기 개바 세와 삼예소 최전 제제쇼 아디 나 아무고로 라마나다 이담에 겐고로 나 조조디소엔 야와세단지 라라제고 나게 면라마 너의 시신주비 둥기르셀라 다다다예 심젠 담제게 선그런남다 간레레게 보수민용에 계속 주게나 야와 구시 야스런 주게 제세데모 노바디세 도에게다 예외 제르베근도 디단동에 자양메자 신대가 야즈 베나제 天主教都的这些人的新年3天当被去吞，最先住了保险马街，不知谁的更多当去去吧。龙水对比米些之类，这面啊三别的说明啊，公众为给你路之间是些肉送给那我的给吧。大些大这对你些尊主古大这送你郎着，这些大这对你这都别过手灭别全当这不啦。江西生业山东松州那中间小县多些年就了，江浙路不这边这嘛那江这学不中。新郎中多结巴大运，点点拉满眼，叫我公边。光天个啦，咱中这边，叫大公这边，叮当的吧。全他们他们这生给男主的，生的生命生给我的。东西满个这样那我的，里不拉大呢，西沙这不啦。也马牛为让那遇多是马里王给让人大多，你在王给西边浪多呀马里这边在这结巴，也把马也给外讲嘛，谁没把马也看得滚给，看到马也说着没那他这心也去年到吧。天下家刚给传吧，没的没下家刚给个吧，老人的别今年的嘛，这样的对给他那个吧，你嘛多个为叫做了，个人的你多那上给先啦，他现的的面个呀，没去年关系上那的不啦。那要是了，多要是人的，多要是了，这样让给，也要是了，个要是人别中多他们这生了这吧。绿旗这边公鸡马的，今他们对这龙给马这，马这牛不啦，让不着些别生的娘们给先用了。查拉多别，我都不上是些有没生给就俺给，听不牛别，芝麻当着别，现在给做没有点不。他们是老样样的别，在东面的呢，极限那个人，有没得老的送去吧，你去面让我让给些吧。娱乐的别，玉面神说，东什么的别，身边我为，你了的别，你在哪子了？这不是生给你老多吧？一切照完的你下呀，这大大这我无马前不一，的你滚的做些些样子，这些滚的都别定多。前方没别的先gün些没甚至没别不是只有老人的别没多人也说真没娘娘运气没法伤心娘也只把让子了这俺多只把让心因说他没些把帮了这多没这几年等不到这人间大多三业，呀马多王爷他们过了，冬天没得没别生见了，生命年纪越来越大，生命年纪这样啊，别这点我冬天见不了，从这个啥这边浪中的这面年纪更多光不。多来中见当关系，当心情面接上给心热问，上给全脑这边没那么做面讲什么他心上给，求君叫我世界都见，当那不给我今年月别，接他的搭档心间当接给没那的。 实行住有如之。那你给我当街做两面到五个月，开不了半天干嘛吧？记住更多面这些。哦，那说，都是些，那说。